So welcome to another Friday training deep dive with myself and Stephen Collins. Over the last few weeks, we have really been giving you an introduction into your training, how to build your training program and how to progress your training program. Last week, we took a deep dive into all things muscle building and hypertrophy and how you build, periodize, and the best training methods to use. In this week's episode, we're going to discuss the same thing with strength. What is actually strength training? We hear words like neural and nervous system adaptations, but what is it that makes us strong? We discuss the science of it and we discuss the practicality of it. How do we set strength targets for our clients? How do we set strength ratios and work on limiting lifts? How do we build a strength block? What indicator lifts are good for you to use and more? Like last week with the hypertrophy sessions, we now then talk about our top 3 favorite strength training methods, from step loading to wave loading, and what do we think is the most overrated strength training systems. If you enjoy the show, please share on social media tagging myself and Steve, and I will leave you with myself and Steve Collins discussing strength. So Steve, to continue on our little bit of a series of training methods, we talked about hypertrophy last week, and let's talk about something that is probably your bread and butter for the most part, and that is strength. So before we get stuck into some of the actual training methods like we did last week, what are the key things you think need to focus on if their goal is to get stronger?
Well, it's a real simple answer is they need to lift heavy weights, and those heavy weights, like discussed on previous episodes, should be above 70% for most people. And the more experienced you become, they become higher as percentages, so more than 85% and above. But
how does someone work out what 70, 85% is?
So basically, if you know how much you can lift for 1 rep, then you need to do a bit of mathematics and work out what you can do for 70%. So and then that's what you would sort of work at. And then depending on the sort of protocol method that you want to use, whether it's singles, doubles, triple reps, or, wave loading, which we might discuss, or 5 sets of 5 at 85%, there's all those different methods. And you sort of use a percentage to then start that strength training process. But ultimately, you need to lift some heavy ass fucking weights.
Yes. I mean, and when it comes to saying, if you're working a lot of this stuff off percentages of 1 rep max, do you test the 1 rep max with everybody?
Not all the time. This is, I hate the answer. It depends. But as you know, it depends, how experienced is the individual? Do we have to do a 1 rep max test to work out their 1 rep max? No, you could probably estimate it from a 5 rep max, from a 3 rep max, possibly from, if you have a speed device, you can use speed to work out what their 1 rep max may be, what they can, stuff like that. So no, not always testing their 1 rep max.
So I suppose it depends on experience level, right? Unless you're dealing with an athlete, where you tend to be working out an estimate of 1 rep max based off 5-6 reps.
Yeah, pretty much. For example, next week I'll be traveling at the end of next week, and perfectly coincidentally, it works out that a bunch of my youth athletes are in the off season now. Some of them are sort of starting their swimming season, so it's testing week. So I'm going to get a bunch of them to do some testing, and they're between the ages of 12 and 18. So their testing will be mobility testing, flexibility testing, etc. We'll do some power testing. And then we'll do some strength testing, which will be most likely 3 to 5 rep max testing.
Do you do this testing? Because this is the thing I always think with people who do 1 rep max testing. Are you doing things over 1 day or several days? Because let's say, even with long rest periods, if I'm going to test my 1 rep max on my squats, I'm going to test my 1 rep max on my deadlift, and we'll maybe talk about, are they the best lifts for strength training as it is? But surely one will interfere with the other. No matter how long the rest periods are, no matter how long in the workouts you are, you're not going to get a true gauge of someone's 1 rep max if you're doing both.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's when you're lifting heavy weights, it places a huge demand on the central nervous system, and it fatigues the brain and the central nervous system. And I think it's estimated 8 to 9 times longer to recover than the other systems. You know what I mean? So it takes a long time to recover, which is why you get a lot of people, you know, if they do a heavy lift, they might feel ready to go after a minute or two. But the stronger you are, you may take 5-10 minutes to recover, you know, and again, it's level of training experience and how strong you actually are. But yeah, you're right. Like, you know, a deadlift, if you do a heavy deadlift, it may take you a couple of days to recover from that. You'd be stupid to do a squat on the same day, right? So yeah, with the kids, I'll break them up into 2 different days. We might do an upper body day and then a lower body day. Like, so if we test their upper body, push pull, you know, like a chin up and a jerk or an overhead press, they're pretty good at that sort of stuff. And if we do like a lower body strength day, we may do like a you know, like a trap bar or a front squat or something, you know. So break it up over the week.
Yeah. And I suppose as well, if you're thinking there's going to be an interference between lower body exercises, your split could be maybe you do a deadlift and a bench press on one day, and then you do a squat.
Yeah, of
your
course,
chin up
of
second
course,
on the other day.
Yeah.
So the two there's no interference between between one and the other.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Other than
And again, it's like if you're doing 5-6 rep max testing, 3 rep max testing, again, it's not as neurologically demanding and taxing as maybe doing those singles. You know what I mean? Yeah. So you've got a better chance of recovering a little bit better, a little bit faster. So, but again, it depends on the individual, innit? You know what I mean? So, and their sport, or if they're just training, you know, like if we're just testing someone for, you know, if we're just working with a general pop client who wants to build some muscle and, you know, maybe we want to run a 12, 16 week block, or maybe spend a whole year doing some good heavy strength training. Do we need to test them 1 rep max? Probably not. Do we need to test their 5 rep max? Probably not either. But sometimes it's good to test because it teaches them, you know, how to get under the bar and, you know, I mean, struggle with a heavy fucking weight, right? So it teaches them, exposes them to heavy loads and potential to grind repetitions. So it's a teaching experience in itself.
That's something that's really underestimated, I think, as well as the psychological component of strength training. But when I look at strength blocks I've given to my clients, I often report back of the mental benefits of them handling the weight. Like, I think, don't get me wrong, when you get really advanced lifters, people fail on strength because of strength. But I think when you get more beginner, intermediate lifters, people fail on strength because they psych themselves out of a set. So I always talk about when I trained Rebecca Jays, right? You remember Bex, big, strong New Zealand deadlifter. And she got stuck at around, she ended up with a 147.5 kilo deadlift. That was her top. And she got to 120, she was freaking herself out. Like, you know, you see it, right? When someone doesn't push through the legs because they're worried about it, so you start to try and pull the bar, and the first thing you see is the spine and the sternum go. Like, so I was like, okay, right, we need to take back. So I used my accumulation phase to do, and again, maybe it's not taught for today, but escalating density training. And that just psychologically just got used to picking up the bar more than it was anything physiological that affected. Maybe we down-regulated the nervous system and calmed it down by doing that as well. Maybe. But I think that's something that's massively underestimated.
Yeah, I agree, and there, you know, like psychology is really, really important. It's what can allow someone in a competition to, you know, lift something that they've never lifted before, or if you know, sport someone to break a world record or do something they haven't done before. The psychological input is huge, and is what may be deemed as a competitive max rep. You know what I mean? So the amount of, you can imagine the amount of hormonal things that occur, you know what I mean, in the brain, the stress and the adrenaline and all those factors, fans or whatever it is, you know what I mean, people in the gym, if you're at the gym, it's going to motivate you, and then you're going to go heavy and go hard. But that's very, very taxing as well. So, you know,
it's positive and negative as well, right? Like, you at a competition might get psyched. We both went on a powerlifting stage tomorrow, right? Like, let's face it, you're lifting more than me regardless of the scenario, but let's compare this to our baseline. So you might go in there, freak out on stage and lift not as good as what you know you could do. I might have the best water max I've ever had because of the cheers. And that's something that I think is another thing that's people don't think about. Right? Some people might fall to bits in a 1 rep max when it's just nobody watching and they're on their own. But other people might be their best training session of their life.
Yeah, I mean, I've always lifted the best weights when I've been training with partners and when I've had people around me. Not just about fucking come on, but just I don't know, like it's just something about it, innit? It just gives you that little bit more. But then
upper body and squats, deadlifts not so much. But upper body and squats, there's an element of safety there as well. Like even if you know you're structurally sound on a bench press, and you know you're not going to get pinned, and you know where one rep in reserve is, having a spot sometimes just gets you an extra rep, even if they don't touch the bar.
Yeah, and that's so true with clients as well. You know what I mean? 100%. You know, like if they feel safe, then they'll go for it. You know what I mean? And normally they'll get it. So yeah.
I mean, before I go delve into the science of actually what getting stronger actually is, on that note of a spot or someone just being there, how much of 1 rep maxes is a skill rather than it is like not a training skill, but a skill of being patient?
Yeah,
because your 1 max is going to be slow, right? And you see it with clients a lot when they're new to this. There's reps that leave on the table because as soon as it starts to get trouble, they bail. And a 1 rep max is going to be the slowest rep you'll ever do.
This is like just to tell you a story and then go back to this, like how when I train like the kids and they're doing testing or just normal training, I don't coach them and I coach them, but I don't spot them much. I teach them how to spot, and then they spot each other. So they learn how to spot, and they also understand, okay, this is how it's meant to look from this position and how it's meant to feel, etc. Yeah, from that position. So I always teach them, it's perfect, isn't it? Like, as you know, as a coach, you only, like, if someone's bench pressing, you only interact with the bar once the bar goes back down. If the bar stops moving, you still don't touch the bar because they may be able to hold it for a few seconds and then continue driving the weight. And
just to quickly key off there, I think it's an art though. Sometimes it's like,
certainly, yeah.
In 1 rep max testing, it's different, right? If you're going pure strength stuff, maybe you are only touching the bar when it's going down. But I think 90% of your training, timing of a spot is incredible. It's that ability. My job to spot normally is not once the bar's stopped or when it's going down, because that's too late. My job is to come at it just before it stops, just to keep them moving. And it's not a spot, it's literally just a half a finger just to keep them
not slow. Even 1%, is it? It's just to keep the bar moving. And I mean, like, listen, as coaches, if we you know, because we're talking about strength and heavy weights, I mean, hypertrophy stuff may be a bit different. Obviously, we might want to do more force reps and grind out reps like that, right, with assistance. But when if we're testing, like that's a failed test if we help. That's a failed test. We don't want to go there. We don't want to fail any tests. That's setting them up for, you didn't do it. We want to say, all right, you completed it, you know? So, and again, you know, like, yes, experience, you'll be able to grind reps slower than someone who isn't, because you're technically more proficient and you know how to grind reps.
Yes. Yeah. When it comes to carry on, actually, because you were still telling the story, right? Sorry, I cut you off with your story.
Well, no, I mean, it wasn't even a story. It was just like, you know, this is what I teach the kids. Like, learn how to spot. Like, you're not going to touch the bar unless it comes back down. You know what I mean? Like, if it stops, don't touch the bar, because they're still trying to push that weight up and complete the rep. So then they understand that, okay, when I'm doing the lift, I've got to keep pushing that fucking weight. It just because it stops, don't just let go and expect the spotter to grab that weight. Keep trying to push. We're trying to work on 1 rep max, which means heavy ass weight, it's going to move slow and it might stick a little bit at those sticking points. We've got to keep pushing.
And depending on the lift as well, like trying to leave it for your spotter, that's not always possible. You know, you're spotting me on a squat, right? I'm not going to Zercher squat that thing off your back. I'm certainly not going to bicep curl that thing off your back.
Well, let me tell you a story about the worst spot I ever had. I was in a commercial gym and I was doing some reps, right? Heavy back squats. And I think I must have done 8 sets, 10 sets. It was a lot of sets. It was fatiguing work, heavy work. I got down to my last set. I said to the trainer who was working at the time, listen, do you mind spotting me? Yeah, cool, man. I trusted him. He's a trainer. You know what I mean? You trust the coach. You trust the trainer to know how to spot you. Anyway, so I went down into the bottom of the squat and I got stuck. All right. And I didn't have the safety pin set. I got the guy spotting me. Now, as you know, when you spot someone on a squat, you try and get your arms around their torso, trying to help pull them up, right? Yeah. Anyway, he grabbed me. I was in the bottom, and he grabbed me from the hips. He grabbed me by the hips, and he pulled me up that way. So all I did was go over, face planted the floor, damaged all my back and everything. And that was from a coach, a trainer who you'd think knows what he's doing. So if anyone's listening, you got to be careful.
Yeah, I see it all the time with coaches. The ones I get, and I think one of the biggest reasons why it's not in every lift. Sometimes it's just you don't know how to spot. But I think one of the biggest reasons why coaches sometimes struggle to know how to spot people on heavy reps is because on certain lifts they aren't confident themselves to get into a client's personal space. The example I give, amount of coaches I see spotting clients on a back squat, hands on the bar. For people who are watching this, not on YouTube, people are listening to this, hands on the bar like they were going to take it off in a half bicep curl position. Get in there. Get close. I tell you what, if I can't speak for the female train like lifters out there, but if I was a female lifter, I would absolutely rather a male trainer get a little bit too close for comfort than me get squashed under 100 kilos, right? Yeah. For a second or two. Get in. You know, like people I think are too scared these days to get in there and touch their clients, and in turn they end up doing dangerous spots.
So basically get right up close to their ass, and if you're on the bench, get your balls in their face.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not teabagging them, it's not a spot. And you've got to wear shorts because you've got to let the air circulate to get me in a mental headspace for the spot.
I think like as we always talk about, the level of coaching, the level of personal trainers is very, very poor. And I remember doing my course and I mean, we learned safety, but safety like don't lock your knees out on the leg press and, you know, shit like that. I can't remember learning how to spot someone. Maybe we did. I just can't fucking remember. It was obviously, you know.
But I also think to a degree, the way the normal, I'm speaking to the UK here. I don't know about NASM and places in Asia, you know, that sort of stuff. But in the UK, I did my level 3 in a commercial gym. I would say you did as well. So 90% of the people, I did mine in a David Lloyd. Have you been to a David Lloyd gym?
Yeah, very nice, yeah.
Very nice. They've got good hammer strength equipment half the time, like good equipped out gym, right? But 90% of the population are like middle-aged wives of rich people because they can play tennis, they can go swimming, and then you got the elderly people. So you're gearing you up to work in such an environment where you're showing people equipment, you're showing people how to set someone up on a leg extension, you're showing them the basics. They're not. It's a different skill set to if you were learning your one-to-one, your PT qualification in a strength and conditioning gym, or if you were getting your level 3 from Charles Poliquin himself. It'll be a very different experience. And I don't think anyone's ever really mentioned that, but like the setting and the aim of what, because Fitness First did the business part of my course. It's all geared towards working in these facilities where people aren't there to train hard, that get personal training. Because you do get in these low, like Fitness First club gyms, people that want to lift hard and heavy weight, but they're often lower income bracket meatheads who don't want personal training. And then you've got the people who are of an age bracket and a financial bracket that just need to be not hurt themselves.
I think while I'm thinking it, like, yeah, totally, I agree. And while I'm thinking it, for any coaches that are listening, teach your clients, athletes, whoever you're working with, how to get out of those positions. You know, like if you're benching, how do you save yourself if you're not in the rack? You know, like, or even how to set the rack up properly. You know, like you get a lot of people that are struggling to re-rack the bar because they've set it too high, the rack too high. You know, or
unracking. People have already failed a rep before they've even moved an inch because they unrack. They'll lock in the shoulder position and then they'll just do this to get over the J hooks. Okay, rep's gone. Like,
and even, you know, like even when they re-rack it, like after just normal reps, they're just like, you know, like one then the other. Like, you know, they can fuck up the shoulders, the neck, just fucking re-rack the bar.
And you know what I said earlier on about psychology, meaning people will fail a rep? One thing I see on the bench press, last rep start, all the reps, focus, they're in. Last rep, looking up at the J hooks before they even started pushing.
Bar back.
Just finish the rep, then rack it. Don't look at the rack before you started the rep.
Again, it's patience. They're not patient enough, you know. Yeah, very frustrating. I always tell my clients off when they do that. Make them do extra rep.
The worst, the loudest I've ever told somebody off, and this goes back to someone leaving somebody to spot. I had a client, probably at a similar time that we were working together at UP. Were you there when I trained Rob Correa? Quite small American dude, got shredded, put on a lot of muscle, skinny fat guy. So I was training him on an Atlantis pendulum squat. Right? If anyone who doesn't know that piece of equipment, it's an amazing piece of equipment. Love-hate relation with it, but it's one of the best leg builders because it's stable, it's safe, and you can fail on it, unlike a back squat, right? And he was failing, didn't have the patience, and he just gets out and leaves the pendulum squat with 40 kilos in my hands. And I've never shouted at a client like it. I was like, what the fuck are you doing? Get back in. I just left it in my hands. It's like, Jesus, man. Like, worst case scenario, end up at the bottom. I'd rather you end up at the bottom than crawl out half rep. Disgraceful.
Oh, man. Bicep curls, isn't it?
Yeah, 40 kilo one-arm bicycles on a weird angle. So going back on the strength a little bit.
Yeah.
You spoke about the nervous system. For someone, obviously, if I said to you, define how we get strong, you're going to go, well, you lift more weight. But actually, from a scientific background, what is actually happening? How much is it nervous system? How much is it muscular? What is happening when we get stronger? How does this happen?
So when we lift heavy weights and strength train, there's primarily two things that occur, two adaptations that can occur. Those are neural adaptations, and the other one is more morphological adaptations, more sort of functional sort of things. Yeah, neural adaptations mean exactly what it means. It's related to the brain, the central nervous system, motor firing, synchronization, and firing rates and frequencies and that sort of stuff. Very complex sort of things. Yeah, maybe related to things more such as muscular strength and muscular power. Whereas
what's the difference? What's the difference? Because some people might not know what's the difference between muscular strength and muscular power.
Well, power is a complex topic, actually. It's not as simple as we think. But just think of strength as like, from a practical standpoint, how much force we can produce. Whereas power is how sort of fast can we produce that force. Okay? In its simplest explanation. So how that relates to the brain, like we discussed on previous episodes, how fast can we relay that information from brain, neural pathway, motor unit to muscle contraction? Okay. Whereas morphological adaptations are more, like I said, hypertrophy based, like muscular adaptations, tendon, connective tissues, ligaments, tendons, and those sort of things. So we've got two ways we can improve adaptations from strength. Now, obviously, they're both related and, they are interrelated, but you can prioritize one more than the other. And we can do that through various methods and philosophies of training.
With so we mentioned nervous system adaptations and then the morphological adaptations. And obviously, you mentioned muscular things in there. We also mentioned tendons, connective tissue, this sort of stuff. So if we're going with the assumption slightly like your longer time and attention, higher rep work, a little bit of what we spoke about last week, we'd talk about the hypertrophy, muscular adaptations, and the lower, heavier stuff with the nervous system adaptations. What about the tendon stuff, connective tissue? How are we making that strong as it could be? What impact can we have on that stuff?
Well, I mean, strengthening your tendons will come under the side of morphological adaptations. Yeah. So, some of the connective tissues. And if anyone doesn't understand what a tendon is, a tendon basically attaches the muscle to the bone. Okay. And it helps transfer forces. Okay. Like between muscle, tendon and joint, and it helps movement occur. And under heavy loads, our tendons will have to work really, really hard to stop you falling, or stop the weight just dropping, or stop you tearing the muscle off the bone or whatever, And when we damage tendons, that's because we've exceeded our how do we term it? We exceeded our sort of loading capacity, if that's the right way to term it. So tendons are really important when it comes to strength development. And if you're using poor technique and poor methods to develop strength, and the tendons don't adapt at the same rate, then that's where people start getting injuries.
Like crazy pec tears. I know you're not a big pro wrestling fan, but have you seen Cody Rhodes this year did a match with a complete pec tear?
Really?
We're gonna get this live on air, right? I don't like the fact that I'm Googling on air, but I'm going to show you this picture, and I want people to hear your reaction. He was training the day before pay-per-view, and he still decided to come and finish the match.
Damn.
Yeah, right?
Damn.
For the people on YouTube, I'm showing Steve a picture for people on YouTube. People on YouTube can see this. For the people listening on audio, it shows pictures. Yeah. He was cleared to wrestle only because it was so torn, he couldn't do any more damage. Which is, I think, well, maybe you can't to the pec, but you're going to compensate. You might do harm elsewhere by moving with that thing.
I hope he didn't give anyone a clothesline after that or anything. Jeez, man.
Maybe with the other arm. I don't think he could give himself a clothesline with the main arm. The match is interesting.
But bro, can you imagine how much adrenaline he must have been having? I mean, it's still fucking painful, but damn.
Wrestlers are unbelievable. I listen to some of the things that you can do. Like I see people get hurt, small injuries and can't get out. You get a bit of a niggle and, oh man, I can't train today. And then I see like Triple H tear both of his quads and walk around, and like adrenaline's part of this, but how brave and ballsy do you need to be to do that? Like 20 minutes on them. Like they're freaks.
Absolute beasts. Freaks. Yeah. Absolute freaks. Yeah. Beasts.
So with the tendons thing, so you're saying that the tendons have to adapt at the same rate as the muscles. How do we ensure that? How does that not happen from training? Like, how does one go faster than the other? Like, how do we stop it?
Well, I mean, like, I think the fundamental principle is making sure that you obviously lift with good technique and biomechanically lift well. Okay, so making sure that your barbell path is correct, etc. So you're not putting too much stress on connective tissues. Okay, I think that's the first and foremost thing. And then making sure that, like I said earlier, like your load tolerance is correct and using the correct loads, which is why testing is really important sometimes. And it's why being patient on the negative is really important, and moving weight, the appropriate loads is important, and then managing your fatigue, not just taking pre-workouts and stimulants before going into train if you're really fatigued and tired, because then you could damage and tear a tendon, for example, like, which happens, or a muscle. So managing all of that recovery and adaptation process is how you really manage, the strengthening of tendons as one with muscles. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I suppose that's why you're saying that's why test is important, but it could also be why testing is not important, right? Because injuries occur when we surpass tissue tolerance. So let's say start doing high reps, you wouldn't go from, let's say, a set of 15 to 20 repetitions all the way to a 1 rep max, like in session to session. It's just too much of a leap. You're not tolerating to it. But if you, we'll say linear, for example, periodize down, you build yourself to that position where you can sort of maybe handle that next jump up.
Yeah. And like, it's clear that once you increase anything by, whether that's intensity, load, volume, whatever, by more than 10%, you're at a higher risk to get injured. So you need to build towards testing and slowly get there. You can't just go from doing 3 sets of 10 for the last couple of months to doing a 3 rep max test. You're putting yourself at risk. Most of the time people will probably get away with it, but you may get injured, or you're not going to maximize your 3 rep max or your 5 rep max, right? Because you know that when you put a heavy weight on your back, it's fucking heavy. You know what I mean? So, that's demanding for the nervous system.
Yeah. So you're saying there about increases of more than 10% potentially increase someone's chance of injury. Now, I also presume that there is a percentage increase where it's just pointless. Like it's barely a progression. If I went from 80% to 81%, like what is the point? So what is from block to block for you? What is the sort of bracket of percentage change that you'd be looking at to see improvements?
Yeah, I think like again, it's experience dependent and like their training experience. Because someone who's really strong, like 10% is huge, but for a beginner, 10% could be fuck all, right? If you bench press, if you're a female and you're doing a 5x5 strength block and you're using the flat barbell bench, let's say you're using 40 kilos for five. Listen, what would one of your female clients right now press for a 5x5, like a beginner client? Maybe the bar 30 kilos.
Bar to 35 kilos, something like
that. Let's say 30 kilos. So you got a 20 kilo bar, fives on each side, right? Now they're going to do 5 sets of 5, okay, which will represent about 85% of their 1 rep max. Now, a 10% increase there is what?
3 kilos.
3 kilos. It doesn't sound like much, but that's huge. 10% is huge. That's where microplates come in. You know what I mean? So you might want to just add half a kilo, you know what I mean? Because it represents a smaller percentage, but overall, it's still a big percentage. Whereas someone who can squat really heavy weight, that 10% is huge. If you can deadlift 200 kilos, 10% may only be, what's 10% of 200? 20 kilos. That's huge weight. You can't just add that on. You know what I mean? So there's differences there in experience, and how strong someone actually is. What was the question again?
So how much a jump would you normally give? And you kind of answered it.
Yeah. So generally, if you've got a beginner, it could potentially though be 10%. You know what I mean? Because they can tolerate those big jumps because they're less experienced, but they have a bigger window to adapt, whereas someone who's experienced, 10% is huge, So, generally anywhere between 2 to 4%, I would say.
So before we jump into the actual session themselves and how you put together a strength session, like the exercise selection, in terms of periodization, we spoke about our methods of periodization last time. When you're coming to periodizing for strength, do you have certain periodization models that you tend to prefer to use? And if so, why?
Yeah. So if I have someone doing a competition that's like where they have to peak, whether that's a powerlifting comp or a weightlifting comp or a triple jump or a fucking, something like that, then like a shot put or something, then we'll use a simple linear periodization model, a very subtle linear periodization model where we just increase intensity and slowly drop off the volume where reps come down and load goes heavier and heavier. And then they would then transition into more power-based sort of work and then peak for their competition. Where if I'm just playing with someone like a gen pop or someone who wants to work on hypertrophy and we're maybe running a 12, 16-week strength block, we may accumulate that and manipulate sort of accumulation and intensification phases.
What's the benefit of an undulating model over a linear model?
I think it is certainly more fun. It exposes people to different variations on rep schemes and intensities and loads and exercises. So it's a nice way to get variation. So it keeps them engaged really well. I think that's probably the best thing to get from it.
Yeah. I also think as well, you talked about earlier on, you want nervous system adaptations and morphological adaptations, right? One of the good things about the undulating models for most people is that you can spend a block working with that, developing the nervous system. And when that gets a little bit taxed, you can back off there, let the nervous system recover whilst you work on some of the other things to have more muscle to be able to handle bigger loads. And then you go back to it. So you don't really ever need to deload from that approach like you might in a linear model because the opposite phase is essentially the deload to the other.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, like I said, if we're using someone like a power lifter or like a field athlete who needs to shot put and throw and get a PB and get medal and get on the podium or whatever, then there's we have our key performance indicators, we have our key lifts, our key power lifts, our key strength lifts that we need to get to and prioritize. We work towards them and then we go and execute. You know what I mean? Whereas someone, like I just said, maybe general pop working on hypertrophy, we're going to run a strength block. There's not a deal to, it's not as, it's not as...
Not as a deadline. You have a strict deadline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's, and on that linear model, we can just program deloads in anyway. You know what I mean? So
do you, when it comes to actually building your strength programs, do you have a system of how you like the exercise selection to look? Like, what kind of exercises you go first? What goes second? What's your A series, B series, things like this? Is there a way that a signature that your programs look like?
So again, I'll use that model of the two different types of people. So with the general pop, I like to give them lots of variation of, say, squatting. So I might give them heels elevated squatting, barbell squatting, safety bar squatting, pendulum squatting, goblet squatting. I might use all different methods of squatting and just periodize that so that the level of difficulty gets harder as they progress over that strength block. Whereas with someone who's trying to compete for a competition and peak, I may just keep the same exercise in there and just hit squats. I might just front squat for 12 weeks.
Sorry to cut you off there, but if you say that Gen Pop client, because I'm going to ask about strength targets in a second, but I had this thought here there. If you're undulating with the general population client and you want to have some strength targets, rather than saying, right, we're going to work on, hypothetically, let's say squat. And you said you may have these variations of squat. I presume some of them are more suited to your accumulation phases and some are suited to your intensification phases, right? So instead of just saying this is going to be your back squat, well, you're probably not going to have that much back squat in your accumulation because you're probably not going to do sets of 12 on a back squat. You might, but probably not. Would you then we're going to set a goal for your pendulum squat and we're going to set a goal for your back squats, and you work towards the two?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Like, I mean, if we're working on strength, then it's probably best to test it, right? Before and after. Okay. So what we're going to use to test first, is it a 5 rep max front squat, or is it a back squat, or is it a deadlift? Okay. Well, then we need to test that same exercise at the end of our 12 or 16 or whatever week block. So, okay, this is the test. We're going to do it again here. So then how do we get there? You know what I mean? Like, so, yes, basically.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then, so you've got your main list, which obviously will vary. Are your main list always your biggest indicator lifts?
Yes, when it comes to strength, when it comes to testing strength and getting strength improvements, yeah.
How often is it squat, bench, deadlift?
How often, frequency-wise?
No, how often? Does every one of your clients' indicators are either a combination of squat, bench, or deadlift?
Change that. Say that question again and change it. I didn't hear you properly.
So with your athletes, is their strength targets nearly always a combination of squat, bench, and or deadlift? Is it one of those three all the time?
With my general pop, no.
Because you don't train any powerlifters, do you? You don't train anyone that has to do those lifts.
I have, but not at the moment. No.
No. So, would the squat be the best bilateral pattern for a strength target for your clients, regardless of structure? Some form of squat. I'm not saying it has to be a back squat.
Yeah, and this is it. There will be I always try and get a pressing exercise variation, whether that's overhead press, incline press, dip, and then a squat variation, whether that's front squat, back squat, safety bar squat, whatever they can do, or deadlift variation. Yeah. I mean, we're not going to spend 12 weeks trying to improve their 6 rep max power raise. Okay, like we want to lift some heavy weight that's going to recruit maximal mechanical tension, and
Would
those
you
are the
ever
big.
set an indicator as a split squat or a hack squat? Or would it always be a bilateral free weight squat?
And maybe a split squat, yeah. Maybe like a safety bar, single leg split squat, lunge, you know. But again, it's risk versus reward. I think if I'm general pop, I probably wouldn't use that. But for an athlete who is very single leg dominant, then maybe I might use that. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just interesting because obviously when it comes to the strength stuff, I'm always in two minds about it. Because on the flip side of things, like no way should everyone necessarily be back squats, and not everyone's got the proportions to do it. And if you're a powerlifter, then and you're tall and long, then suck it up and probably realize you're not going to go very far. But I also think it's like, but on the flip side of this, it's like, okay, the best lift for you to work on may be putting how many plates can you stick on a pack squat. But there's a ceiling eventually where optimal and long-term reward enjoyment in training changes. Because as soon as you put in someone as a hack squat as the main strength goal, there's only load to really increase. You can't really like look at increasing skill because it's a relatively stable, easy lift. You know, how many plates can you put on it before you kind of maxed it out? There's a point of diminishing returns. Whereas if you find some form of squat pattern, even if you can't get all the way down, even if it looks more like a squat morning, actually do you create more longevity in training? And if your goal isn't to be the world's best powerlifter, could that also be important?
And that's it, innit? It's like strength is a skill. And, you know, like there's different ways to skin the cat, you know what I mean? Like there's different ways to develop strength, and you got to think of what your goal is, you know, like, you know, when we think of strength, it's really important to be strong, but there's a point where too strong is just unnecessary, right? You know, like that's why we have these sort of bench markers, you know, like can we squat your body weight? Can we deadlift 1.5 times your body weight? I'm just making these numbers up, you know. Can we bench? Can we do a certain amount of pull-ups at body weight? Can we, you know what I mean? These numbers are there for a reason. And obviously athletes who have goals of winning, their strength goals are very different to general pop strength goals, you know what I mean? So maybe for general pop, we can use machines to do 5 rep max testing. Can we improve this? As long as it's short term, it's fun and they enjoy it, you know what I mean? Why not? However, is there a skill element to it? Yes, there's a skill in terms of learning how to grind, like we discussed, and learning how to produce force. But there's a lot more to it, you know, when it comes to the nervous system development that we can get from doing squats and deadlifts and benches and overhead work.
And I suppose as well, it's like for when you're looking at the exercise mechanics craze, yeah, they're people, and I'm one of these people that like you do testing passive and active, and it doesn't move. Like I'm not an 8th degree incline press is what I'm getting to, right? But for every person like that, there's a person that thinks they're like that and never goes there, and that's the reason why they can't get there. So, like, if you don't have someone to hand to actually test where your end ranges are, work with what you can own and eventually try and improve it.
Yeah, definitely.
Like getting stronger in these positions. Because to be honest, who knows my limitations through here that are genuine limitations now? Who knows if that's genetically my shoulder sockets like that, or was that a bone spur? Because I was told, Simon, never do anything overhead. And over time, my skeleton changed, and now I don't have it at all. Like,
that's it,
it's
isn't
impossible to look back and say.
Yeah, and that's why you have to do various testing. Like, as you say, you know, passive, active, different types of testing to see people's anthropometrics, limitations, range of motion testing, and then choose the appropriate exercise for them. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So when it comes to the rest of your structure test, your indicators as A's, I presume you go accessories B's, like main accessories B's, and then sort of like either tertiary work or hypertrophy work or smaller muscles in the end of your workouts.
Yeah, generally, yeah. I mean, especially for general pop, you know, like I'll always have those sort of reps to failure or higher rep work in there as well, because they like to get that sort of stress through the body as well. And I don't think for Gen Pop it will affect much of their strength goals and strength adaptations that they get, because they're not lifting 250 kilos or trying to produce power in a sport, whereas the athletic pop, we may not do any of that because it could be a bit more taxing and affect their sport performance, training, etc.
Yeah. How do you begin to identify weak points in somebody's lifts? Because it's a bit of a minefield, and there's loads of different approaches to this. Some people have strength ratio graphs. Some people just do it by eye. How do you start to go, right, this is what we're going to work on?
Well, I think I used to use a lot of the structural balance testing, but I don't really use that much anymore. What does my client enjoy is a big one. Like, do you like squatting? All right, let's push your squat. You know what I mean? Like, my goal isn't always to get a general pop structurally balanced. Yeah, we want to have nice, strong hips and we want to have nice, strong shoulders. But why does my general pop person doesn't need 10% of external rotation for 8 reps compared to their close grip bench? They don't fucking need it. It's just a waste of time. It's overkill. It's stupid. They want to be strong, look good naked, and that sort of shit. You know what I mean? So if our strength goal is there, I'm going to choose the exercise that fits them well, like for their mechanics, but also one that they're going to enjoy doing.
Yes.
So I don't mind. I don't mind if their deadlift is too much for their squat and their 1 rep max is a deadlift, and then we're going to push that number higher. I don't care, as long as they're not going to get injured or exacerbate, if that's the right word to use, make injuries worse.
Do you think there is, for the people that are coaches that have played around with or looked at the Charles Poliquin strength ratios, and he got them from various other strength coaches, they're not his, and you look at these ratio graphs, I look at them and I go, I like the idea. It gets people a focus in training that may not have a focus in training before, but they're super flawed in the sense of they are pathetically small in some lifts, and absolutely no way are you doing 15 kilo external rotations. Shut up. You also have the limiting factor that the deadlift is nearly in all of these graphs the benchmark based off your 1 rep. So your deadlift can never be the weakness because it's always numero n equals 1, the deadlift. Do you think, having gone through a master's and gone through the science, if there was more work put into like this, looking at this sort of stuff, do you reckon that there is scope here for something really incredible in terms of proper testing tools for people that isn't based off anecdotal evidence from Canadian strength coaches?
I think the thing with Charles's stuff, like he has some of the best experience and results, so that is evidence in itself. And then there's a lot of coaches that use it successfully. That is evidence in itself. You could say they're evidence-based practitioners. And obviously, again, then it's just like, okay, well, the science community has a lot of research, but they're always 20 years late. So they never get real results.
Very true.
It's like cluster training, like what they say about that,
I thought we spoke about with research the other day, right? People that have put themselves forward for research are probably going to be people that enjoy training. If you're just someone at home going, we're looking for participants for this deadlift strength ratio study, you go, I don't want to do that. And the people that Charles Poliquin is testing and these strength coaches are testing, they're probably genetic freak, high-level athletes.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, when you're working with athletes at that highest level, the pinnacle best, they're already the outliers. And when you're doing studies and tests, I mean, these outliers, you take them out anyway. But generally, a lot of people that doing their masters and stuff like that, they training studies aren't done a lot because they're very, very difficult to do. You can imagine trying to get 20 people to squat twice a week for 8 weeks and trying to control everything. Like, it's virtually impossible to find that, level of people who are intermediate to advanced, So those sort of studies don't get done much, which doesn't help support evidence for certain, Canadians or whoever's philosophies and systems. So I think like there is a lot of good stuff that you can use out there, like assessments that you can use that a lot of people use,
What are your favorite ways of assessing people in terms of strength and where to work on?
Yeah, I keep it really simple, man. Like, I use tech if I want to measure power. I use, speed devices or weightlifting or throws and shit like that. And then if I want to measure maximal strength, I use sort of isometric methods, like how much force can someone apply isometrically on, like a mid-thigh pull or something like that if I'm working with athletic people. But you can still use that on general pop. They just pull on something at their mid-thigh level and see how much force they can produce. But there's something called dynamic correspondence, which is 5 sort of cardinal rules that if you approach them in the right way, then once you know what someone's target is and goal is and sport is or whatever general pop strength goals are, then you work towards those and it will allow you to choose the testing and the methods that you have to choose, there's many ways to do it.
So what's that thing you said that you use? 5 correspondence.
It's called dynamic correspondence.
So what is that?
Basically, it's a bunch of sort of principles that were used in Russia, and that got popularized in a book called Super Training. And they just basically, how much force can be produced at a certain. Let's just take someone who is choose a sport.
Rugby.
Okay, cool. So rugby. So the 5 principles. One of them may be about like the amplitude of movement. Yeah, like the direction of movement. Say. So what sort of movements do they need to do to produce force and power and become good athletes? So let's just look at they scrum, right? So they have to apply force. How we look at it globally is horizontal, but to the athlete is vertical.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean they have to use hip thrusts to improve that position. They need to do squats because it's a vertical movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
So that's maybe one of the rules that one of the principles. And then there's like, where do they get most peak forces at certain joint angles? So, is there, in a scrum, I don't know where the peak forces occur, but you'd expect it to be, as they're driving the leg at that top position. So what exercises match that? So it's probably like a mid-thigh power clean or something like that. So then there's one exercise that we probably need to test. So there's a back squat that we need to test, and then a mid-thigh power clean that we have to test, and there's 2 exercises straight away that we have to use.
That's interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sort of helps you categorize exercises and what to use to prepare someone and make them strong, make them powerful. And the simplest way is to look at it is, well, if I've got someone who's a power lifter, we know they have to squat, bench, and deadlift. So if we use a dynamic correspondence, quite simply, they need to bench, squat, and deadlift. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's quite interesting. It's been so many years since I looked at super training. I definitely need to revisit it, but that's definitely an interesting way to sort of start to piece this together.
And it's one of the reasons why, the force velocity curve. Have you heard of the hyperbolic force velocity curve? So up here we have force, down here we have speed. And, to train an athlete, you must work on all these things, right? Squats are up here, weightlifting's in the middle, and like sprinting, throwing shit is down here. But I don't agree with some of the things that they say, like weightlifting down here in the middle. So people think maybe squatting will produce greater peak forces than weightlifting. Well, I don't think that's the case. Like, if you're doing power cleans from the thigh, you'll produce greater peak forces than doing a back squat. So maybe a back squat isn't a good exercise to choose for developing maximal strength and peak forces. Maybe better measurements to look at are things such as impulse. But I mean, this is more sciencey sort of stuff, and what you'd probably use with athletes when it comes to testing. But it's things that people should think about, terminology, and don't just test power because we think power is important for sport,
Yeah. That absolutely makes a lot of sense, and it's a good way to start thinking about it. So I always think it's a systems way of thinking is really, really important when it comes to training for any goal, because you can sit there and look at the ways of getting bigger or the ways of getting stronger, and there are so many approaches. But how do you see the forest through the trees? It's having these sort of like guiding principles to work off.
Yeah, and like I said before, like how people see mechanical tension as the underpinning thing towards building muscle or sport performance. But there's a lot of ways to manipulate mechanical tension, and it's just manipulating certain principles of force, like you can produce force for longer periods, or you can produce force faster, or you can create greater peak forces. They'll all improve what's underpins actually impulse.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So moving on to some of the training methods that we use, obviously we listed out a few. Do you want to kick us off with what is one of your favorite 3 training methods for strength?
Yeah, so I love using more of especially for beginners anyway, I like to introduce them with like more sub-maximal lifting methods, which is, let's take the 5x5, like we mentioned earlier. 5 sets of 5, you accumulate 25 reps, which is fantastic amount of like volume, and you use roughly 80-85% of your 1 rep max. This is a great introduction to start from, I think, for beginners.
Yeah, I agree with that. 5x5 is one of mine as well.
Yeah, and it works, man. It works really, really well. I've got good success with it. Everyone loves it. But that's a really good way. That's something really good to use with beginners.
It's that easing in, especially if someone is maybe a bit more, especially with general pop where their nervous system is already a bit fried, they've got a lot of things in their life. Yeah. It's a good way of sort of like easing them in without going something that's going to be so neurally taxing straight from the off. And I think that or on the loading on the joints taxing as well.
Yeah, and like it can still be really, really hard doing that, like 5 sets of 5. It's hard work, But I mean, if I'm working with someone, I might actually work them at 75 or 75 or I might work them at 75 or 80% for 5 sets of 5. So we start more conservative. And actually, I'll quickly say that now. Most strength training methods, people start too aggressive with them, They need to start more conservative and give themselves space to get better. Otherwise, they're not going to get better and they'll get worse, most of the time. I think people lift too heavy, go too hard too early.
We mentioned it the other a couple of weeks ago about stopping the set when someone hits failure, but especially when it's strength. But yeah, you see people grind on because it's what they're used to from bodybuilding programs.
Yeah, it's definitely different. Like you'll overtrain so easily and potentially just go backwards, And that's where auto-regulation is important. You know what I mean? Like auto-regulating your training, depending on how you feel on that day. That's okay. Like you can back off.
We said earlier on about a psychological component to strength training. So let's say you're doing 5x5, right? And last week you did 80 kilos for 5x5, and let's say you do like. You do 80 kilos and you go 5, 5, 4. Now on set 3, then you said you've not beaten where you were last week. This is the time to call it. Do you call it and move on, which is what a lot of strength coaches would say, or do you go from the fact that there's a lot of emotional and mental and psychological side to strength training? Do you do 1 set lower so you don't end on a failed rep?
Yeah. And this is it. There's a few different ways to do it. Some people will cut that, and sometimes I may do that as well. But sometimes I may just let them carry on and just accumulate those reps that they can get. Like, all right, cool. Let's do our last 2 sets of 2 or 2 sets of 3. That's fine. If they're really struggling to get 5 and then maybe getting 4 on that last set, okay, let's just do our last 2 sets of 2.
Would you always keep the same load and less reps as opposed to a back off?
Yeah, man. But let's say, all right, you got your first set of 5, your second set of 5, your third set you couldn't get 5, you could only get 4, and you're busting your balls here. And you want to cut it. I might say, you know what? Let's just do our 2 last sets, but let's do 2 reps, 2 sets of 2, but let's move that bar fast.
Yeah.
And now what we're getting, we're going to produce more force. Like I said previously, we're going to get the same, we potentially high force output, but we're doing less work.
Yeah.
You're still going to get strength adaptations, right? Because now we're working the nervous system and the speed part of this equation.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That's what I do. I always keep the sets. I might drop a couple of reps and just, right, let's move that bar fast. As soon as the speed's gone, I don't care if you don't get 5 or 4 or 3. I don't care if you get 1. Move the bar fast, re-rack it, done.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. When I sort of look at sort of training like that, similar to you, I often start with either a 5x5 or even just like, even though technically this is a functional hypertrophy routine, even like a 4x6. So I start on the heaviest end of hypertrophy that they can be, and then ease them into strength. Maybe you go from there to like a 6x4, and then maybe go into, well, what I'm about to say, my favorite method for strength training in a second.
Yeah. What did you say? 6 sets of 4?
Yes, for an example.
Okay. Yeah. That's good, man. And that's it. Like, how many reps is that? It's 24 reps.
So you mentioned this earlier about the 25 reps thing, and I know what you're on about. For someone that's listening and someone's like, well, why 25? Why 25?
Well, there's just, like we mentioned last week, there's a certain amount of work that you have to do. And to get strength adaptations, 25 is a good number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
25 is a good number.
Yeah, that's something that I learned from Steph Gazol. And he was like, he generally finds that accumulating 25 reps. And then when you look at if anyone follows Steph, if you look at his strength ratios graph, which I actually have to pull up here. I'm not going to pull it up and show it on screen. But if you look at all the sets and you add up all the reps, there's somewhere between 20 and 30 reps. All of them add up to that, pretty much all of them. Yeah. Just by
when you're lifting heavy weights, too much is going to be too much. And if you're using advanced methods, then the reps will be way less volume, but the tonnage will be way higher, right? The total volume load. And that's what you're trying to manage mostly, is the volume load, which is the reps times the sets times the weight. Yeah.
Yeah. So with the first one I'm going to mention in terms of my top 3 is generally my favorite. I use it for peaking. I use it to get over psychological hurdles in lifting. And I think, what I'm going to say here, it's a wave load.
I love it.
I love a wave load. And I think the biggest thing for a wave load is every set you can put a positive spin on. Like, I love a 5x5, but if you're having a tough day and it's hard and you're heavy, maybe you had a bad night's sleep, you get to set 3 and you go, oh my God, I've got 3 more sets of this. Whereas if I'm doing, for example, let's say 7-5-3. When I get to the end of that first rotation, I may go, 7, that's a lot of reps. But it's lighter. And then when you get to the 3, you go, oh God, that looks heavy. But it's only 3. There's always a positive spin to make you go into a set with confidence, which means a lot of the psychological reasons why people fail lifts, I find, tend to disappear in a wave load.
Yeah.
Because there's an easy reframe. I also think it's a really good peaking strategy, especially if you're going for like your 6-4-2s or your 5-3-1s or something like that, because you prime the nervous system, you're working up to a heavy double or a heavy single.
And wave loading is exactly that. It should be like the low rep wave loading is primarily used as a peaking system, a peaking method. But yeah, like you say, a 7-5-3, 7-5-3 is brilliant as well. To get those sort of heavier reps in as well. Like it's brilliant method to use. And if anyone doesn't know what like wave loading is exactly what you just said. Like, it's where you may do like like a 3-2-1, heavier, go back and do a 3-2-1 again with either the same load or a slightly heavier load.
I always give the estimation of, if I do, let's say, a 6-4-2, right? My second set of 6 will be what I did in the original set of 4.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
I tend to
if I'm doing like the heavy stuff, I tend to just microplate and add 0.5 kilos, man.
But from set to set, like all the way through.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah,
just
so
small increments, that's all you need, small increments, like just small increments. But then like you get beginners again that if you introduce them to wave loading, if you wanted to, say do like, whatever it is, you could maybe add 2.5 kilos each time,
Yeah. Do you find your clients really enjoy it as well when you get clients that are ready for a wave load?
Yeah, they like it because it's different, isn't it? Like, it's novelty, and anyone always responds to novelty, and it makes them sore and stuff, and it exposes them to heavy lifts, and the rest periods and stuff, I think it's brilliant. I think it's a great method.
What's your second method that you had down?
My second method was, I've discussed it before. It's using like a CAT method, which is compensatory acceleration sort of training, where you move the concentric as fast as possible, really explosively.
Describe this method a little bit. This is one I'm less familiar with.
Well, it's really simple, actually. You just move the bar from A to B concentrically as fast as fucking possible, and you can put any rep scheme on it. The goal is to just move the bar as fast as possible. And with that method, you can then start using bands and chains and shit like that.
Do you measure speed with your speed device? Is this one where you measure speed?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we spoke about speed device before, and I usually use my speed device when I'm testing. Like when it comes to just training, I don't mean to be mean to people, but if coaches are using speed devices to monitor speed and fatigue, they're probably a beginner coach. You should be able to see it with your eye, the level of fatigue someone's going through. So yeah, I may measure it. I may measure the speed if we're looking for a particular quality of training, like if we're training strength speed or whatever. But yeah, CAT training, and you can reverse that and use sort of compensatory deceleration training where you just lower the bar slower. So control the negative. And if you combine them both, then you're sort of doing both methods. So manipulating those are fun as well.
Could you argue that going into a slower eccentric method, even if the reps are low, is more of a hypertrophy technique than a strength technique? I see at 3 reps, you did an 8-second negative on a deadlift. When you're looking at the time of the tension, the amount of metabolic tension you'd have on that muscle, the load would have to come down to equate for that. So you actually be lifting lower percentages of your 1 rep max, despite it being sets of 3.
Well, I mean, eccentrically, you can lift way more weight, right, than concentrically. So if your percentages are correct, you may be lifting more than what you can press.
On a press, that works because you can use things like eccentric hooks, you can add manual resistance, all sorts of things. But you obviously can't do that, let's say, on a deadlift. That would be just a slower eccentric with the same load, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. I think, you're right. I mean, it could be considered more of a hypertrophy method, but I would still categorize it as a strength method because of the mechanical tension that you're creating is very, very high, and you're going to get more strength adaptations, neural adaptations from that, as opposed to morphological adaptations.
When it comes to that, the acceleration stuff that you were just talking about as your second method, when would you use this with somebody? When would you go, we're going to focus on the speed and essentially a little bit more power output of this, as opposed to doing a 5x5 or a wave load or
more so when someone's having to peak for a competition, or when you're trying to peak for doing some testing, we may use more acceleration based methods like that, compensatory acceleration training methods. So
is that because whilst it trains speed, also limits fatigue in the same way that you might do for something that's slower? And
well, Well, I mean, training power for some people can be more fatiguing, you know?
Mm.
Like training fast and explosive can be more fatiguing. Like, you know, like Westside Barbell have their maximal effort day, which is heavy ass weight, which is very central nervous system based. It's very strenuous for the brain, and the recovery of the body takes long. And then they have the dynamic effort day, which is the reverse. It's a lightweight, moving it really, really fast. That's also very central nervous system fatiguing. So speed is very fatiguing. I think speed is more fatiguing than strength. You know, strength you can maintain it for a month. Like speed, you can lose it within 7 days if you don't train it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going on to my next one, you had my first one, which was 5x5s, and generally, if I have my introductory strength block, and we spoke about this last week in terms of how we periodize hypertrophy, right? And I said that I do a high intensity bodybuilding style phase, focusing on certain key muscles. I'll do a high volume phase, an accumulation phase, and then I'll deload with a strength block. So when I go through my strength blocks, you can either think of this as you could do these one after another, and they're a linear progression. One leads into two, leads into three. Or you could sort of go into these and go, this is every third phase. So every cycle progresses.
Yeah.
So I will start with, like, let's say a 4x6 or 5x5, depending on how somebody is, like high intensity functional hypertrophy or low intensity strength. I will probably linearly go down into something like a 6x4, like a straight linear thing, change some exercises, focus on a few different things. And then I'll finish off with a wave load or a peaking strategy.
Cool.
Now, if I was going to go back and do that again with a second thing, I'll be looking at the same sort of thing. What's the sort of the next time? Maybe a 5x5 at the start, because it's slightly, even though small, higher intense in the first lot. But another peaking strategy I quite like is step loading. Step loading, by the way, like first time I ever did step loading was with you, because you used to program when I worked with you a lot of 886-644s and 664422. And
that's my favorite step loading method, 664422.
Why that one?
I don't know, man. I just really enjoy it personally, and like everyone I'll do it with loves it as well. Yeah,
I like it because you mentally,
especially those doubles.
Yeah, you mentally, you kind of you get away from fatigue, and you're just getting better as the session goes on. It's quite mentally stimulating, and it's another great peaking method because you're working towards the heavy two in that example.
The nice thing about that, it really bridges the gap between a beginner and an intermediate, and someone who needs to take that technique under fatigue and heavy weight to the next level. Because, the 4 reps with the heavier weight was a bit sloppy. Now we're going to do 2. Let's go heavier. And then those 2 reps are normally perfect technically. So it's just like, okay, we're still going to go heavier. Can you refine this technique? And they normally can do it. But you could also maintain the same weight and do a double with perfect technique and then go heavier. So you know what I mean? Like
you can also regulate it within set to set.
Yeah, which is true for any sort of method, obviously. You know what I mean? Like you can do it like progressively overload them by making it technically more proficient.
But you also said with the 5x5s earlier on that sometimes we could call a set if it's not progressing as well. With this, because of the staggered rep scheme, descending rep scheme, I feel that it's easier to continue progress and auto-regulate it like that. It's easier to do. There's things that change that make this more applicable.
Yeah, it's a really nice strategy to introduce people to doubles, like 2 reps, heavy 2 reps, and get confident doing heavy weights for 2 reps.
So what's your next one? I think I've got a feeling I stole one of yours with wave loading, because I bet that was when you're 3. So
I had wave loading written down. I have wave loading written down, but my third one is using like more of a ballistic method, like a myotatic method. It's speed focus. You can tell my philosophy has changed over the last few years for strength methods. I like using more of a myotatic speed method now.
You can tell you're a pure strength guy and I'm more a bodybuilding guy as well, by the methods we've chosen. I know we both like both methods, but mine has started onto the pure actual strength. It's often a slightly higher volume, and you really are intensities.
Like since doing my masters, I've really like delved into biomechanics and like the whole thing about power and acceleration, force, velocity, this like all that sort of shit. So like I love using methods to overload people by just increasing speed and utilizing stretch reflexes and shit like that. And that's where my last one is, like a ballistic method, like myotatic reps, where say if you're doing a squat, for example, you go all the way down, and as you get into that bottom position, you essentially bounce and boom, pop back up. And what it does, it uses the stored energy within tendons, and you maximize the stretch reflex.
I presume this is a very advanced method, right? Because there's a difference between bouncing at the bottom with control and bouncing at the bottom and letting everything fall to bits.
Yeah. It's an advanced method for sure. Yeah, it's a ballistic method. Ballistic methods are advanced methods. You know what I mean?
I'm thinking off the top of my head here. This could be absolute utter shits, and tell me if you're not. But I'm just thinking, could you prepare? I know it's not the same because it's not done at the same level of pace. But in your if you want to get someone ready for a ballistic method, but you just don't think they have the mental fortitude to just do it under control, in an accumulation phase, would this be the time to try 1 1/4 reps? So say you get used to, in the 1 1/4, come down, halfway up, you're controlling it, and it's slow, it's proper controlled. And then you get really good at that. Then when you go into your intensification block, you go, I want you to do exactly the same as we've done for the last 4 or 5 weeks, but I now want you to do it quick.
Yeah.
Now, it's not going to be rubbish because they're already...
That's a great practical way to do it, like for people that want to use their brains to see that. Like, introduce a quarter, so go all the way down in the squat, come up halfway and pause, go down, even pause, and then pop back up. So you're adding that quarter but under control. More time and attention, great for an accumulation phase where we stress volume and reps. And then in the next method, if we want to now start introducing more of the dynamic component of it, go down, come up and pause, and then drop and pop straight back out. And then in the next phase, if you want to then just tag on another peaking phase, you can actually drop and pop, which is my method.
Yeah. I'm actually, and I hate doing this, and you see me topping away here, I've actually been inspired by what you're saying here. And I'm actually writing some notes, which I don't do very often on air, but I just don't want to forget it.
Yeah, it's a great method. And like I said, it's advanced. You need to be, and that's like what we spoke about earlier, tendons. That's what tendons are for. They store energy and they release energy. So as you go down on the bench press, for example, all your tendons in your elbows and your shoulders build up kinetic energy, and then on the way back up, we release that, and then it comes through the muscles, and then we release that power and that speed and strength. All right, it's the stretch reflex, the stretch shortening cycle. It's how we develop power and speed, which is more important for power sport, because if we're trying to just strength train, it doesn't matter how fast or slow we move weight as long as it goes from A to B.
Yeah.
So you got to choose who you want to do it with.
Yeah. So moving on and finishing off with our most overrated. This is harder. And you said this is harder too. I think there's massively loaded. We were spoilt for choice of overrated hypertrophy methods, right? Because lots of people do it. Lots of people want to do it. There's a lot more bullshit out there and some really boring methods when you're just looking at time and attention. When as long as the intensity is strong enough, nothing's bad. I look at the rep scheme graphs from Kilo and all these things, and I'm looking down the strength because any of these I think are a bit rubbish. I'm like, no, not really. But what did you come up with?
There is a few now I think about it.
Okay, go and list them. Yeah.
I think methods that, like, let's start with coaches that, first of all, sometimes it's not the method, it's the coach that says, this is how we have to do it on paper. We have to stick to these percentages, these reps, these loads, these intensities, these days. That's not good. Because heavy loads, you're going to get a lot of fatigue. You can't keep doing that. You're going to get injured. Okay. So one of the sort of like weightlifting methods was the, what was it? The weightlifting method, where they just trained them 3 days a week. 3 times a day. They would do the clean and jerk and the snatch 3 times. That's all they would do. Singles as heavy as they can, and then rest. And they'll do it every few hours. That was the I can't remember the name of it. It's basically the opposite of the Russian system. So for people that aren't aware, basically the Russians dominated the strength and power sports in Olympics, in the world back in the day, decades ago. And their philosophy was to train sub-maximal. Okay, they never lifted above fucking 80, 90% unless they were peaking. So over the year, they would do thousands of different exercises and work really lightweight, moderate weight, like sort of bodybuilding methods, 60, 70% of their 1 rep max for weightlifting and stuff. And they would choose thousands of exercises. And then as they got towards their competition, they would peak. So the way they termed it was pretty cool. They said, the wider the base, the greater the peak. All right. So the more foundational movements they had and the more skills they learned, the better they became at becoming good at one specific skill, which was weightlifting. Whereas the other nation who then started to dominate, it's really annoying me now. Name me some Eastern Bloc countries.
Austria, Czechoslovakia.
The Bulgarian method, of course, is Bulgaria. So Bulgaria then started to dominate weightlifting. And their method was, so the Russian method was volume-based. Lots of volume, we can get really strong without using lots of high intensities. So it's very, very volume-based, right? And variation-based. That's why I love my accumulation intensification methods to be very variation-based. Whereas the Bulgarian method, when they started dominating, it was intensity-based. They didn't use a lot of exercises. Like I said, their competition lift was the clean and jerk and the snatch, or maybe like a press at that point as well. But that's all they did. The Russians never even did it. But that's all they did. And they did it 3 times a day, and they would lift maximal. So it's the complete opposite. It was intensification-based. But I mean, like, obviously there's a lot of drugs back then, so they could recover from it. But then they would break a lot of athletes. They would, like, one world record holder, but they would break them all.
Well, tendinitis and repetitive strain injuries, and there'd be lots of injuries coming from that, surely.
They'd fuck them. But they were all doped up, right? So they could get away with it. So these two opposing methods in different eras, they dominated the scene. Right? But I don't agree with, I prefer that Russian model where like lots of variation, lower intensities, 70, 80% sort of intensities, variation on reps and sets and speeds and exercise selection, doing it a lot. Whereas the other method, the Bulgarian method, is just really fucking heavy. I'm talking 90, 95% plus 3 times a day, every fucking day for 4 years, for 8 years, for 10 years, for 12 years. There's some people that still have these sort of methods that just pure heavy loads, you know? That's just stupid.
Yeah. I suppose, I wonder if your nervous system adapts to things like that. So we talk about nervous system fatigue,
yeah,
right?
I think it would, yeah. I think it would.
If your nervous system's always a bit fatigued, your nervous system would get stronger eventually to the point where it's actually not that fatigued. At the same level.
I think it would, yeah. It certainly would. And, you know, I suppose that's the case for, you know, powerlifters, right? That choose that sort of West Side method that lift really heavy every week, you know? They adapt to it, they do. But there's obviously a level of PEDs that they use as well, right?
Well, I suppose it depends, but yes, probably a lot of them. So I think that leads into my most overrated anything. I couldn't pick just one, but I was like, anything 1 rep max related outside of competition. And when I say 1 max, I don't mean like if you did clusters and you end up with ones, or you do a 5-3-1 wave load. Because even though you're lifting 1 rep, they're not true 1 rep maxes because there's an element of accumulated fatigue.
Yeah.
But going up to 100%, you look at powerlifters. Top powerlifters don't often train ones, train singles. They train like at lower intensities, higher rep ranges, and then to do a one on the day and then leave. And I think certainly if you scale back to the more beginner to intermediate sort of strength guy, the amount of people that think I need to just lift heavy stuff. How many people just go, fuck it, I'm going to do a one?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah,
Why?
and that's what I mean with that's the one I don't like. That Bulgarian sort of system where you just lift heavy. But that's what the Bulgarians did, bro. They literally lifted 1 rep maxes 3 times a day for years. The same exercise, and they got away with it. They got injured eventually, but that's a stupid method.
It's also a lot of training as well, right? Like you're doing short sessions all the time. Like he had to dominate life more than anything else.
Their workouts were like 15, 20 minutes.
How many of them a day?
3.
You'd have to live
mad,
in
isn't it?
Like, I know Olympians return, they give everything to the sport, but you had no life other than that.
Bro, no.
Also, Olympians aren't paid. So how on earth is that feasible?
Yeah, well, they're just if they become gold medalists, then they're heroes. Yeah, so
they're sponsored essentially, probably to the food and things like this.
But you're right though. Yeah, like a lot of the powerlifters, they don't use those heavy loads. Like they use heavy loads, but like lower percentages, and then they peak or whatever. But like if you look at China, they dominate a lot of the world sport. You know, like power sport, strength sport. You know, like weightlifting, and they use a similar method to the Russians. They use lots of variation. You see them doing bodybuilding techniques and dips and handstand push-ups and all these wacky bodybuilding stuff and these real cool variation weightlifting derivatives that some people have never seen before. That's what they're using, and they're breaking all the world records. And them guys are jacked as well, you know. So it's crazy what we're seeing with Olympic level weightlifting at the moment.
Yeah.
But actually, I'll just quickly mention one method that I've done. I got injured, which is why I'm a bit biased and I don't like it. I don't think it's the best strength method, but it's used by hundreds of people. And I might get a bit of backlash if anyone listens to this, but is the Wendler 5-3-1 method.
Why so?
I think it's not enough volume.
Mm-hmm.
And have you ever done it?
I have, but very, very, very long time ago.
And then you take your percentage and do as many as you can, for one big set. I think it's a lot low intensity work,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe good for a beginner, maybe not, because they're doing lots of reps with percentages that are high.
Yeah. I also think as well with that, it's like you're guaranteeing every session is going to end on a failed rep, which is for hypertrophy, great.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's a good.
Do you want to leave everything with that?
But then even for hypertrophy, that's the thing. Even for hypertrophy, it's not enough work.
No, it's exactly.
It's not enough work, and then for strength, it's not enough intensity. So it's just like you're doing both, but you're not getting any. But that's it. Could be a good bridge for beginner to intermediate, possibly. But I think overall, I don't think it's the best method. And yeah. Unless you tweak it a little bit,
Interesting. Okay, cool. I mean, I think we've basically covered strength training to a nutshell here. I mean, next week's gonna be an interesting one. We're talking about training for fat loss because we're gonna both probably agree the fact that training is not the most important factor when it comes to fat loss whatsoever. And you have the two schools of thought of you train like you would train for hypertrophy, but your aim is to just not lose muscle. So train heavy enough not to lose muscle. But then we get the other school of thought, and I think this is something you'll know more about, is you see a lot of strength guys use training at higher volumes to create a deficit. I'd argue how much of a deficit does that actually create? But people use density methods, high volume methods, and we can discuss that a little bit next week. But I think that'll be a bit of a different one.
Yeah, that should be a good topic, and I'm sure a lot of people would like that one. We'll have a lot of people's goals are fat loss, you know what I mean? And we always tell them to strength train. So, okay, well, how can they do that? We'll tell them. Now, that was good. I think, going over strength today, we've gone over a lot of the strength in previous episodes because we're talking a bit more about that maximal strength side today, but all those other things, progressive overload, and what else have we spoken about? Progressive overload,
mechanical tension, loading patterns, periodization methods,
is underpinned, or is underpinned by strength adaptations and what we discussed today. Like, we've gone over all that, like, to get strong, you need to lift heavy weights, you need progressive overload, you need to create mechanical tension and that sort of shit, So, yeah.
Well, man, Steve, thank you as ever. I'll chat to you next week, and have a good weekend.
Cheers, boss. Cool.